analysis of the nonprofit sector ministry. There was a story a couple of years ago about one of the members of the British royal family apparently had a nonprofit organization. This nonprofit takes kids on camping trips and sailing and things like that. And so it was a really big deal for people in Baltimore to say they were thinking about bringing that to Baltimore. Now, most people would generally say that more is better, right? But there is similarly an argument that needs to be understood about who gets promoted within the nonprofit sector of the city. There is undoubtedly a sort of Eurocentric cachet around the British royal family that people who are doing work in Baltimore don't have. They don't have the name recognition. They don't have the perception of being something that's elite. So someone who is no doubt well-meaning, but seems highly unlikely to have any true conception of what a urban youth in Baltimore would need, is going to get promotion, is going to get publicity at the cost of someone in the community. Similarly, let's take an example of a music nonprofit. There are nonprofits in the city that do things like give back to music training. Most people will obviously say this is a good thing. But again, I would say a race-neutral analysis of such a thing ignores some potential necessary questions one has to ask about such a thing. No one's ever going to say at that nonprofit that Mozart is better than Tupac. And part of the problem is that when you're thinking about the way whiteness as a social-psychological function in this country works, no one has it. The simple omission of African-American composers, the simple promotion of predominantly Eurocentric composers is going to promote a cultural way of understanding for that black youth that these are the masters, the Eurocentric canon, and that raises issues to that child when they go back home and they see their parents don't listen to Mozart. Their parents listen to Motown. No one is ever going to say Mozart's better than Motown. But that's what you lose when you have a colorblind analysis of the issue, is that no one ever has to, because there is an entire social structure that promotes Mozart over what that child is getting from their family. And what is that child going to do? They have to pick between the people who they speak to at their nonprofit and potentially the culture of their family. There's been studies about how language, you can see a similar function when black kids bring their slang into school and they're told that's not a proper way to speak. But my parents speak this way. And so you have kids who are left having to choose between what they are told is the proper culture, which is actually just the dominant culture, and the culture they get at home. So again, no one has to ever say Mozart's better than Motown. But that's an issue that must be addressed for something like a music nonprofit to function effectively in a black city. Now, a bit of a twist on this. Let's say you have a race conscious person working at this music nonprofit and will say, maybe I don't want to teach the Eurocentric masters, maybe I have some issues with that. Maybe instead I'll teach blues and jazz, alright? That would seem to on face to be a step toward a more race conscious pedagogy, and I would say it probably is. But I would say that while stuff like that are necessary, it would be insufficient to address the depth of the way whiteness permeates the social psychology. So even if I'm learning the blues magic, even if I'm being told about E.B. King, Harlem World, if every time I go on the internet, I am told that Eric Clapton and Stevie Ray Vaughan are the greatest blues musicians of all time, how am I going to feel as a black youth? Even that well-meaning attempt risks replicating in such a whiteness, because I'm thinking, oh my goodness, it took white males to perfect the music that my people invented. So if you aren't engaging in a race-conscious conception of pedagogy, even these well-meaning attempts risk replicating the structure. It's not about being nefarious. It's not about having malintention. It's about recognizing that there are structures of power that allow certain people to have access to classrooms, to have access to resources, and there are certain implications to the pedagogy that these people produce, even at the level of unconscious choices that these well-meaning educators make. Another example of disproportionate access to resources, criminal justice work. I think an example of the nonprofit industrial complex in the city is criminal justice work, in the context of there are nonprofits that get funding to do rehabilitation work in the city. Many of these nonprofits are predominantly white-run, funded by white foundations, And they have a particular pedagogy about how they do their work. They hire a lot of youth, and they have youth advocates for that issue. And the youth advocates advocate for things like having a program where the state actually gives the nonprofit funding for every form of criminal that they work with. You know, it just seems like a logical thing that if you prevent recidivism, keep someone out of jail, and saving the state money, you get money for that. And so this setup was hailed as a very progressive structure. You know, the guy who set it up, the head of the corrections department, was hailed as a progressive thinker. Now let's look at the same guy who's engaged in a black nonprofit. There is a Quaker organization run by a black woman who does work in jail. They do rehabilitation work in prison to try to bring a race-conscious discussion to the predominantly black prisons to prevent these prisoners from going back into gangs, to essentially prevent a legitimate social alternative for these black men who are incarcerated. This organization was recently banned from many prisons in the state of Maryland because they were seen as being promoting dissent, they were seen as promoting division, and they were accused of smuggling drugs into the jail. Now, you have the same director of the corrections department who was lauded as being a progressive thinker. He is engaged with one nonprofit, engaged in the other nonprofit, and saying, I don't think this is something I want to support. Even though they are bringing free rehabilitative services into this jail. So, when you look at the discrepancy between how institutions with institutional legitimacy and those who are seen as illegitimate or function, when you have such a glaring discrepancy of people doing essentially the same thing, it's very hard to not see it in racial justice. I can say this especially because this organization, the one run by the Quaker young lady with African American, not young, older lady with African American, they had a conversation with Gary Maynard, the director of corrections in America. And he was flippant, he was disrespectful, and it was very clear why he saw these as not being people he wanted to work with. Because they were not adopting the proper attitude of deference that he felt was necessary to have good control in his prison. And so when you have someone who has a desire for deference and control, and you have this person running a prison that's predominantly people of color, it's hard not to see that there's a desire for people of color to manifest deference and control that's not placed on white activists who are doing the same work. And that not only affects their ability to get resources, that literally affects their ability to even do their work. Because if they don't do the proper deference, they may risk being banned by being promoting the same work. I'm going to do a few more examples, and I'm going to try to wrap up here. Take urban gardens. So there was recently an announcement that Baltimore is going to make an investment in urban gardens. They're going to knock down abandoned homes in parts of the city and put urban gardens in. Being on safety type of thing that would be very, very hard to get into. But the question I would ask from this framework is, what's the business model? What's the business plan for these urban gardens? One of the most profitable, and I put in air quotes again, pragmatic ways of thinking about these urban gardens would be you produce local organic produce and you sell it to upscale restaurants. That's going to bring the highest cash flow, right? But what that doesn't do is deal with the fact that many of these urban gardens are going to be made in food deserts. And so opposed to having community control over the urban gardens to address the food deserts that many of these gardens will be in, the logical, profitable structure of nonprofits would be to shift that produce to upscale restaurants to make the profit back. And this is an example of the corporatization of the nonprofit model that has been accepted as a necessity, but when you're dealing with what's supposed to be an issue of community uplift, of community empowerment, the question is, who is it empowering? Is it designed to empower the people in the nonprofit, or to empower the community that it's supposed to serve? Let's take this a little bit further. You could also say that it's a job in these things, right? And so this is just me imagining things, so I'll just say that up front. I can easily imagine this nonprofit doing it like most institutional nonprofits, having people who have experience with nonprofits who are predominantly white in the city, putting a call out for people to work in the garden and getting very, very good people in the community to respond to that call. Even if they hate it. And like, why is that, right? Like, why would you not want to work in the gardens right next to your home? You get paid for it, right? And I think this is, again, why, for us, as Black people in the city of Baltimore, the psychosocial dynamics of racism are something that you can't ignore. Because the very idea of toiling in the soil, growing produce, while you have someone who's overseeing you, who just happens to be white, brings up a lot of historical trauma for Black people in the city. And so it's something that if you're thinking about, you never think, like, it's just an urban garden, right? But if you're talking about people in the city of Baltimore who have a collective memory of a slave experience, the idea of toiling in the soil is something that brings back so much trauma that it's almost off the table. And I would say there's a big difference between someone from this neighborhood growing in the soil under that framework versus a community garden designed to feed their families. That's something I think would be community support. That's something I think would do all of the positive things that most people would say urban gardening does. Connect people to the soil, give people a more holistic understanding of ways they can exist in the world. But it would have to be done effectively. It would have to be done with that understanding of that collective social trauma. So we're getting a little bit short on time. I had a really long quote from a lady who wrote about feminist internships and nonprofits. It's a really good resource for anyone who's doing an internship in a nonprofit. It talks about the experience people had there. I was going to read it. You don't have time. If you want the citation, I can give it to you. So in conclusion, what should we do? Where do we go from here? What does all this mean? And I'm going to basically disappoint most people in the room and say I don't have the answer to that question. And I think it's very important for there would be an expectation that people like me don't have the answer to that question. This talk was specifically designed with an audience of predominantly white students working in Baltimore City in mind. And I think one thing that's very important is that even a desire to sort of say that question, so what do we do? Tell us what to do. It's a desire to sort of have a quick, easy answer to this problem that just doesn't exist. So as opposed to saying what you all can do, I can give you resources to help you all meet people who have answered that question, and I can tell you what you should not do. So, one thing you should not do is think there is nothing you can do, so why try? There are examples of alternative nonprofit structures that I think really engage the issues and the risk of nonprofits in a much better way. For example, there's a nonprofit in Colorado that specifically says, we are fundraising money for South America, but we have no idea what to do with the money, because it's not our job to control it. It's not our job to micromanage them. When they ask us for help, we give it. When they ask us for assistance, we give it. But our business model is you are giving money to people for their own autonomy to do what they want. And they're explicit with that model, and that's the framework for that institution. I think that's an example of a nonprofit that's taking seriously these issues. That's called the Village Earth Initiative in Colorado. Another example of this is it doesn't have to be an explicitly radical nonprofit that takes this approach. The quotes that I read to you earlier were from something called a book that was funded by the George Guns Foundation, not a radical foundation. That's a pretty radical book. And what that foundation didn't do was to try to edit and modify the results that their money was given for. That's another example of the type of engagement that I would see as productive. Another thing you should not do is to think that your traditional method of inquiry can solve this issue. I read Thoreau at the top of my speech, not because I completely support Thoreau, but actually because I wanted to point out that someone like Thoreau would be seen as the go-to resource for issues like this. And even someone like Thoreau has serious limitations when they're dealing with issues like this. Like I said, I do debate. Thoreau actually wrote about debate. He wrote about the counter-hegemonic struggle in debate, how there are people of color using rap and hip-hop to fight the power in debate. And guess who he calls up? He calls up the African-American kid coach of Emory, who does not do that style of debate. He advocates a traditional style of debate that actually help people like me and the kids I coach that we're cheap and we should go home and not debate this way. So even Henry Thoreau's best attempt to be a white ally show his limitations in this scholarship. Basically, there's no ask for this. There's no easy way out of the struggle. What you can do is to take a notion of vigilance and take a notion of being constantly aware of the way that you're functioning within the structure of power and use that as something that can guide you say, more progressive way of engaging these topics. So with that, I thank you.